We don't do sound bites here. We talk in depth. We're just making sure everything sounds good. We've also decided to record this so that people can watch this if they'd like, in addition to podcasts and listening live. So if you're listening live, thank you so much for joining us. The election is over, and I don't know who's happier about that, me or my guest today, John Lorinc. You may all know John Lorinc. He is the prolific, unbelievable, amazing writer from the Globe and Mail, Torontoist. I read a story in Prophet magazine today. John is somebody who's followed the scene in Toronto for so long, and he was the first person I thought of to come on my show, the radio show, the podcast, right after the election. We're going to get to John in just 1 second. You're right in front of me, so we're going to get to you in 1 second. But before I do that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody throughout the city for the support that I've had over the last year. It's been an unbelievable year of my life. It's obviously changed my life in many ways. Nobody thought we could get to the point that our campaign got over the course of a year where people took it seriously. We tried to run a campaign that was all about being mayor, not just being a great candidate. We never pandered for votes, never asked anybody to vote for us. It was all about putting out policies, vision, and a platform that people could understand was honest, truthful, forward-thinking, trying to make this city the 21st century city that it could be. Throughout the last few months, more and more Torontonians paid attention. And as many of you know who are listening to this, we took a lot of shots for why are you doing this and how can you pull this off? And that was the harshest criticism that we faced over the year, which is you're a long shot, you're fringe, you're an outsider, you can't win. I just used that as fuel to our fire because it made us work harder and put out policies and a transit plan and housing, childcare, a pet policy for people who are low income or homeless who can't afford to keep their pets, the environment, traffic, congestion pricing, tolling, all of these things that are conservatively called the third rail of politics that no politician will ever touch. I mean, you had Mr. Ford only talking click your heels 3 times, and you have subways, you have smart track, and you had a little bit more bus service. We decided to be more ambitious. And I will conclude my opening by saying thank you to everybody for the support, whether you voted for me or didn't, whether you supported somebody else. Some of the most profound support that we've received over the last few months are from people who did vote for other people because they wanted the Ford years to be over, but people who really respected what I and our amazing team of volunteers tried to do. And I say this because many of you have emailed me to the point where our email servers are, haywire again yesterday. It is very sincerely said on my part that I am extremely happy that Mr. Tory, of the 3 that really had the shot to win, was the one who came out on top. The city has had enough of a Ford in the mayor's chair. We will talk about this with our great guest today as we go through, but I will say this, Mr. Tory deserves a chance to do what he said he wants to do. This is a city that is divided. John and I are going to talk about that in just a second, and I'm going to get a little bit politically incorrect in some of my questions and thoughts. But Mr. Tory, and I said this publicly, ran a campaign that even though he and I disagree on policy, and that's the way the world should be, there's 31 flavors of ice cream for a reason, he ran a campaign with grace and dignity, and whether you like him or you don't, and I can tell you I was behind the scenes in a way that I never thought I would be, Mr. Tory never makes anybody feel small when he talks to them. He has a genuine heart, and I will not get too much into the other candidates and my views of them unless my usual desire to be unfiltered takes over. But from the day that I met Mr. Tory, and you spend a lot of time getting to know who somebody is and what they're like when the camera is off, Mr. Tory deserves a chance. He has worked hard for this. I watched him pound the pavement for basically a year straight, and there was no sense of entitlement in his campaign. He outworked almost everybody, and I think that speaks volumes. So even though we have fundamental disagreements on policy, those disagreements are discussions that I think are in the best interests of the city, and nobody wishes him well more than me. Many of you heard him say that he may or may not reach out to me in the future to play whatever role he deems fit, because he certainly has an incredible and very well-known team of advisors behind him. But if my phone rings, I will answer it, and even if it doesn't, I will be somebody who does not turn to the negative. He deserves a chance, and it's time that Toronto give him that chance, and we'll see where things go. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And now, and many of you know that I usually have 2 or 3 guests on per episode. Today we have one, because John Lorinc is here, and now you can see in the studio, if you're watching this on YouTube later, we are sitting very close together. The idea of this is almost like we're sitting, I'm not Jerry Seinfeld as a comedian in a car getting coffee, but the idea is that we're sitting here and we are literally shooting the breeze, which is a politer way of saying what most people do when they shoot the blank. And John, thank you for coming on. You and I have talked throughout this campaign in a more distant way, because you have to do what you have to do, but it was very important for me to get on your radar early, because you are one of the writers, and we've talked about this, that doesn't write in 9-second sound bites, and you delve into the issues. So I want to get into the issues today. We have a lot of time to do it. I have, in case you're watching, a sheet that I'll be making notes if you say something that makes me want to talk. But let's turn the floor over to you, and I guess, and I'm sure you're going to write a lot more about this in the next week or two, what do you make of the following 2 things? Forgetting me, this has nothing to do with me today. The campaign that you watched over the last 10, 11 months, and what do you make of the results?
The campaign was exhausting,
Yeah.
And it came at the end of an exhausting term of council. And actually on Tuesday, I felt very exhausted by the whole thing, and kind of glad that the 4 years are over.
Right.
So there was a sense of relief. And I think that I think that it was a very broad-ranging debate about all sorts of topics, and that's good and healthy. And we know what the focus is going to be over the next couple of years, and I think that as you say, there's going to be a lot of discussion about the details of what John Tory has proposed, and then a lot of discussion about this whole question about the divided city, which is something that is bigger than an election platform, but really demands an answer. And if he's talking about that, and if he's focusing on that, then he's doing something that Olivia Chow sort of built her campaign around, and I think that that's a healthy thing. But he's going to be measured against the results of both of those areas.
He ran on a campaign that was very, very focused on Smart Track. And not to go too inside baseball, I mean, people know why that was. I read today that Kathleen Wynne, when she heard that he was elected mayor, was very pleased with that, because Smart Track accords with the provincial plans. Will it be easy or difficult for Smart Track to exist 7 years from now, when I have less hair and you are more exhausted?
Well, hopefully I won't be so exhausted 7 years from now. I'm going to set aside the 7 years number, because I think that was an ambitious number thrown out for the purposes of the campaign.
Right.
And, things happen less quickly in Toronto. As long as they're happening, that's the important thing.
Right.
I think over the next several months, we're going to see a great deal of discussion between the province and between the City of Toronto and Tory's office about how these 2 ideas mesh together. Because so one of the key things that really didn't get as much sort of attention in the campaign as it should have, is that Tory is basically promising a big part of what the provincial government and Metrolinx, the regional transit authority, have advanced as their key priority. So Kathleen Wynne was elected on a promise to spend $29 billion on infrastructure, half of that in the Greater Toronto Area, and a bulk of that on transit. And her plan is to electrify the GO Rail network and to provide all-day two-way service, which means regular trains at 15-minute intervals. And what Tory is proposing is basically a subset of that within mostly, on a route mostly within the City of Toronto, with tendrils out to Markham and Mississauga. But it's not just a matter of sort of saying layering one on top of the other and saying I've got a nice sandwich now. It's there's a lot of fine detail to be worked out, and that fine detail is going to all be subject to a lot of back and forth, hopefully in a transparent and open way over the next several months, and over the next couple of years, I think, because it's not a matter of council just sort of saying yes to Tory's first motion and off we go. There are many steps along the way. Some of them have to do with planning. Some of them have to do with money. Some of them have to do with prioritizing where that money goes.
What are the major roadblocks to him achieving what is the plank of his program? What are the things that will prevent shovels from being in the ground 4, 5, 6 years from now?
Well, I think that there's inertia for one thing. So this is a new plan. It's Metrolinx has been studying the regional express rail idea now for several months, but it's still very much on the drawing board. So so accelerating that, getting it going is one impediment. The second, I think, is a communications piece. I don't think that the vast majority of people in Toronto fully understand what exactly regional express rail and smart track is, right? So he's going to have to explain it more. And he talked a lot about it during the campaign, but really putting meat on the bones of this idea. Like what do the stations look like? Where will they be? What happens around the stations? How do you get up on that railway embankment? These are all important things. And at every station, this will be a discussion. What kind of trains they use. It's all the fine details is where this conversation is going to get bogged down.
I read today, I don't know if you saw this, there was an article in the Post. I don't know if it was a blog piece or a report by a writer named Richard Warnica. Mm-hmm. And it talked about how Smart Track, in its essence, is an idea that's been around for about 10 years. And on one of, somebody they pulled it out of a file somewhere from 10 years ago because it was never executed, it was never followed. Do you know what I'm talking about that? Does that ring a bell? Because it was in his article. And I thought to myself, well, why hasn't this seen the light of day for 10 years in a transit-starved city?
Well, I don't know if it's been around for 10 years. I mean, I think that the idea of electrifying the regional rail system has been around for a while. It's very capital intensive. And, if you look at other, big cities, I mean, there are lots of examples of a kind of a regional rail service that's electrified. I mean, you find it in Paris, you find it in London. And so, it may well have been on a wish list that, Go Transit put together a long time ago. Metrolinx has only been around since 2006. That's when the legislation was created. And the original, the ideas that Metrolinx has advanced at the beginning of its mandate, which sort of formed the backbone of the big move, focused on LRTs and on the downtown relief line and bus rapid transit. So the electrification wasn't sort of top of mind at the beginning.
So if you you said Metrolinx,
right?
So I believe the head of Metrolinx is Mr. McQuaig. I may be pronouncing that correctly or
Bruce
incorrectly.
McQuaig, yeah.
Bruce McQuaig. So if you're Bruce McQuaig and you wake up and it's Tuesday morning and John Tory is the mayor, mm-hmm. is this something where the head of Metrolinx, which is theoretically tasked with all of these things that mayoral candidates sort of may get in the way of,
right?
Is this good for Metrolinx? Does this fit with their mandate? Did they have skin in the game? Or what do you make of that? Because you know more about this than anybody else, pretty much.
I think that Metrolinx is a wholly owned agency of the provincial government.
Right.
Its board is appointed by the provincial government. The board appoints Bruce McQuaig, who's the CEO. So they do the province's bidding. And the province and Kathleen Wynne, who's the premier, indicated during the provincial election that their priority for the infrastructure money that they promised would be regional express rail. Now, Metrolinx has been working on this. They've been studying it. They've been studying a downtown relief line and kind of working up, how that would work. They've been weighing different alternatives about, how do you add transit service in the Toronto area. So now this is the one that kind of percolated to the surface. And I think that if you're Metrolinx, what you know is that the City of Toronto, which accounts for something like 90% of all transit rides taken in the Greater Toronto Area, has had a 6-month-long discussion about an idea that focuses on regional express rail and electrification. Right. So they know where the conversation has gone.
And that's what I thought. Now, you wrote, and because I think that even though something that you wrote is months ago, I think it's something that should be read by everybody. We now have a mayor elected who stands for the proposition that we should have a Scarborough subway.
Right.
And nobody wrote a more ingenious piece. I think you wrote a 5-part or 3-part story about the role. 5-part. And I remember back then I just read it and I'm like, geez, this is some unbelievable writing, because it was about the role of Karen Stintz in what happened and the flip-flop. Now that we have a mayor who was fair and square elected and made it very clear in his platform that he wanted to get on with building the Scarborough subway, is that a fait accompli? Is that done? Is that on the rails, so to speak?
Well, I think that what will be interesting to see is what happens when the Scarborough subway proposal meets funding request.
Right.
Because we had these ballpark numbers about what this project is going to cost. And part of the series that I wrote for Spacing Magazine,
I want you to say to people how they can find it, because it's one of the most brilliant 5-part stories, and it's riveting.
Okay, so it's at spacing.ca/Toronto, and it's in the archives, and it's about the Scarborough subway proposal. We did a bunch of freedom of information requests, so we discovered that there were memos that were shared with the provincial government saying that this is going to cost a lot more than you reckoned, and it could be as much as 50% more, and that would be a reasonable estimate, because it's a big project. Big projects tend to go over budget. So at a certain point, both the City of Toronto and the provincial government in all likelihood are going to be presented with 2 bills. One bill will have to do with the cancellation costs associated with canceling the Scarborough LRT line.
Hundreds of millions.
Well, we don't know exactly what that number is, but Metrolinx has said that the so-called sunk costs amounted to about $84 million, and that's for engineering studies and so on, and that there are unknown costs associated with canceling a contract with Bombardier. So that's one bill, and that's coming, and it'll be coming soon. The second bill has to do with what is the full cost of the Scarborough subway, and it's going to be more than the amount that was allocated, and it could be $400 million more. So this is a priority. Both the mayor has made this mayor-elect Tory has made this a priority. He got a mandate. The provincial Liberal government, they won both a by-election and a provincial election pledging the Scarborough subway. So at some point, these two entities are going to negotiate who's going to end up spending that extra money to build this subway. That's the way it's going to go. It'll be a complicated discussion because the provincial government's got a big deficit and the City of Toronto's got a limited tax base.
So we're going to talk about that tax base. We're certainly going to get to that. But before we leave it, I just want to give a plug out again, because when I read that 5-part article, and for people listening to this live or on your podcast, whenever you get home and you're in the mood to read, not look at your phone and read 140 characters, you actually print the emails that are behind the scenes. It's literally like a WikiLeaks thing. Right. When I read that, I'm like, this guy has gone absolutely inside baseball. For people who know what that is, you're seeing emails from Miss Stintz to other people that are, it's literally showing the truth. I mean, the show is called The Truth, about what goes on while Torontonians are not looking. So if you have a chance, go to Spacing and find these 5 articles, because they are absolutely riveting reads. That's all I had to say on that.
Thank you.
Okay. And you're welcome. And you know that I'm as far from an ass kisser as humanly exists. But I remember when I read those, I'm like, you have to be unbelievably kidding me. Okay. I had lunch today with 4 really good guys who I work with. I was back to work, got to pay for all this stuff, And a very interesting question came up, and I sat at the table and I said, I'm going to ask John Lorinc this in 3 hours. This is the question. We're going to talk about Doug Ford. We're going to talk about Olivia Chow today, and we're going to do that. But Doug Ford got a lot of votes. It is indisputable that he got a lot of votes. And the question came up that if Doug Ford got that many votes, essentially as a toxic, angry, combative, not all that well-liked person, and I'm not knocking him personally. I mean, we'll do a show on what I think of him. That's a different story. But he doesn't have that certain je ne sais quoi, which I don't think is real, and I think is horse manure, that they say his brother has. But not that je ne sais quoi, connect with the people, man about town, loved for all your flaws kind of guy. One of the guys at lunch said, what would have happened in this election if Rob Ford had said, I'm still running for mayor, I'm not campaigning, people please don't forget about me, let me get well, and I'll see you back in December or January on Inauguration Day, but on October 27, tick my name off the box if you would be so kind.
Right.
Would Rob Ford today, based on the astronomical amount of votes that Doug Ford got, in your opinion, be the mayor?
No.
Tell me why.
Because I think that throughout the fall, so he came down with the cancer diagnosis in early fall, and I think had that not happened, or had he stayed in the race, we would have continued to have the discussion about his conduct as mayor, and regardless of the fact that he's ill, and this would have been an issue. And I think layering on top of that would have been a question about whether he's physically competent to be mayor. So I don't think that his personal popularity, which is not insignificant and it's not to be dismissed, wouldn't have carried him past where Tory was.
All right. I had to ask that, and as soon as it came up at lunch, just across from the crowd, I said, who's going to like that question? John Lorinc.
I thought lawyers didn't like hypothetical questions. Whenever I've interviewed lawyers and I ask a hypothetical question, they always say, well, I'm a lawyer. I don't answer hypothetical questions.
Well, I think the good news is you're sitting with somebody who answers all questions and really doesn't care whether people like the answer or not. You're getting it unfiltered. Right. Now, on that note, I was looking at some stories today in the paper, and I said throughout this campaign, and luckily enough, another candidate picked up that message too, that I really don't think anything in this city can really be fixed because people fundamentally misunderstand the role of mayor and how the mayoralty works with a council.
Right. And
that the mayor is not king. And when Ms. Chow was in the running, I said the mayor won't be queen because of all these promises that I'm going to do this. I'm going to invest now. Nobody ever asked how. I'm going to build subways. And I said, you click your heels 3 times and all of a sudden there's a subway. No, thank you. And I talked at length about the need for term limits. I said throughout this campaign, the incumbency advantage of about 90% is something that presents real progress in this city. What do you make of the fact that council is either the same council as was before with all of the great young talent? And I say that very seriously. The great young talent, the Alex Mazurs, the Idil Baralis, Peter Fennick, Andre Dumise, all these people that, in my view, and you can disagree because this is a show about who cares, who agrees, these are people that really would have brought some fresh thinking to some stale wards that, and no offense to the incumbents, they won fair and square, but what does it say about our city and our council where even people like them can't make it through because of the incumbency advantage? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to go to a place that you might not expect, which is...
I can't wait.
So good governance practice by private sector corporations. So I write a lot of business articles, and one of the things that's really important in a well-governed public corporation, publicly traded corporation, is that you have a succession plan at the board level. So board members turn over at a regular rate, and that the composition of the board includes all sorts of skill sets. And our current political system discourages that. So consequently, you have people who are, some of them are really great counselors and some of them are not so great counselors, but they stay in those wards for a long time. I personally think that a 3-term limit is good because then you have 12 years. You have enough time to kind of learn the job because it's a very difficult job and it takes a while to, find your feet. And then you have enough time to accomplish what you want to accomplish, and then you move on and give someone else a chance. I think that, this is not an original thought. I think our council does not reflect the city's, cultural, ethnographic, demographic composition. We have a very, it's still a lot of men. It's not a very, colorful council, and it's, that's a problem because it's not reflecting the city. 44 people can't reflect a city where 46% of the population was born abroad, right. But it can do a better job. And I think that, the reason that we have this incumbency advantage is because it's an artifact of a system that doesn't use parties. I'm not in favor of having a party system at city council, but this is a thing that we have to have our eyes open to, because if you have a party system, you have a way of measuring, the performance of individual politicians against how that party does in power, and we don't have that. We have individual councillors who have very real authority in their own ridings or in their own wards, and individual voters and residents and constituents can see what they do in their own wards. And then they have a sort of then they participate in this collective body called council. And their role in council is very, it's more difficult to discern. And sometimes it's visible in some ways through the voting record, and sometimes it's not at all visible. So you have this system where, we have an idea that somebody is a good councillor because why? Because they fixed your sidewalk one day,
they answered your call.
Yeah, answered your call. Or you have, conversely, you have an idea that, a councillor is not a good councillor because they didn't take your call. But it's not really an effective way of measuring. So maybe there's a better way of holding individual councillors to account. Maybe there are lots of people in the city who are interested in democratic reform who could come up with a way of, sort of a scorecard that's quantifiable and shows something about how councillors operate.
They know what needs to be done.
Right.
They know the revenue problems that this city has. They do not think Joe Penichetti is smoking lines of coke. Okay? They know that this is somebody who spends their life going over numbers that he knows more about than anybody in that council room. Right. But what they said is when they go to the public and they go door to door, if they want to keep their job, and this is why I'm such a believer in term limits and fresh blood. Like, people in Google and all this, if you would have said to these Larry Page and Sergey Brin, well, guys, you're 22 years old, but you can't invent Google till you're 55 and work for Apple for 30 years. Right. What a bizarre universe that would be. All innovation tends to come from people who are young and hungry.
Right.
So I had this conversation with a counselor who was very supportive behind the scenes, and that person said, we just can't go door to door and lay that out because I don't have another career to fall back on. I'm a criminal lawyer. I was in court today. I started a case, right? And that person said, and the best example, and let's get into a policy or two. We started talking about the vehicle registration tax, and she said, Ari, I don't understand why you're the only one that's saying if you can afford $1,500 a year in insurance, you can pay $80 a week at Petro-Canada, you can pay $25 to park downtown, you can't afford $60 for a vehicle registration tax to make sure we can get Wheel-Trans funded and get some other transit-related or other services going. But when I go door to door and people say they saved $60, they literally think they saved $60, but they don't calculate the fact that their Metro Pass has shot up. Their kids paying $5 to go skating or swimming. People don't get that in their mind. So she said, if I want to keep my job, I've got to go to the door and say all this. What do you say back to somebody who says that? I know what I say back, but I speak a little harsher than you. You're more thoughtful. What do you say back in a culture where a counselor who knows the facts and the evidence can't talk about them because she won't keep her job?
Well, I think the word culture is really important here because we have a political culture in the city, which is part of a broader political culture that, undervalues public service. We've propagated this idea that it's a city that can't afford things.
Right.
And these are unfortunate ideas. They're very deep-seated ideas, and they go back. They long predate the Fords. I think that part of the solution to the problem is to create a conversation which is more positive and doesn't emphasize division, doesn't emphasize the kind of politics that the Fords practiced. Now, this is not so easy to do because people are steeped in this idea that you pay too much for government, and we do that at all levels. What I'm hoping with Tory's mayoralty, and I don't know whether this will work out, is that Tory had a positive message. He had a message about revenues for Smart Track, which is dubious, but it was at least a message saying the city has to invest. So it's about changing the big conversation, and I think that if we can sort of redirect the big conversation, then the other things fall into place. The other point that I would make is that in mayoral elections and recent memory, the power of symbolic campaigning has been very powerful. So David Miller campaigned in the broom, not just the broom, but the bridge, and he promised to kill this bridge to the island airport.
Right.
A project that impacted a tiny fraction of the city's population,
right,
but was able to sort of use it as a way of telling a broader story. And Rob Ford, when he was running for mayor, used the vehicle registration tax as a way of telling a bigger story,
right,
which people were receptive to. And I think Tory did the same thing with Smart Track.
Right.
So it's about the stories we tell. And the stories can be negative stories or they can be positive stories.
But they're also, and this isn't a question, this is something that, again, because I was reading about Mr. Kouvalis and, the tremendous role he played in the simplicity of the messaging. It's often an extremely simple message. 10 letters. Smart Track is 10 letters. Mm-hmm. Gravy Train, 10 letters.
Right.
These aren't coincidences.
Right.
Well, one day I'll have to come up with 10 letters. Okay, let's move on. Mr. Tory today went into City Hall and spoke to the bureaucrats and the managers, and you may have seen this. This is public, and received a standing ovation.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that I know lots of people who work for the city of Toronto, and for whom the last many years have been very trying.
Right.
At the beginning of the Ford era, they were trying because their boss's boss would say, "You people are garbage," and he actually literally referred to civil servants as garbage, which I think is a terrifically unfortunate thing to do. I was just parenthetically, I was at a speech given by Calgary's mayor Naheed Nenshi.
Yeah, I read your story about that.
And so the way he describes civil servants in Calgary, I love this phrase. He calls them colleagues.
Right.
It's 20,000 public servants, some of them doing really simple jobs, some of them doing elaborate jobs, but he referred to them as colleagues.
Right.
This is about a story we're telling, right? He's telling a different story than Rob Ford was telling. In the second part of Rob Ford's mayoralty, you had a kind of a different dynamic click in, which is, I think, which had to do with the leaderlessness of council. So, you mentioned earlier in the interview that, what can a mayor do? So a mayor has this brokering ability, right? The mayor has a staff and has the ability to broker deals with the rest of council. And so it's a kind of a soft power they have. But they can direct council to some extent, and they can always make sure that they're on the winning side of a vote, and they have some ability to whip a vote. So the mayor does have an ability to guide the city's policies to some extent, not to a complete extent. But what happened once Karen Stintz challenged Ford on his transit plan was that, there were more than half of the councillors understood exactly what it was to take Ford down. And they did, and they should have done that.
Right.
They were right to do that. But afterwards, we had a very rudderless council, and it wasn't clear who was in charge. And I think for civil servants who are professional people at the higher level, they exist to enact and implement what council tells them to do. And there was this sort of vacuum there.
Right.
So they're relieved because they know that there's going to be a guy in charge,
and he's not toxic.
And he's not toxic, and he's not going to stand up in front of TV cameras and say all of these people are scum.
Right. And I like what Mr. Tory said. He goes, "I'm not going to be an ass." And I thought, that's as far close to a four-letter, because I can come up with some four-letter words. Yeah. That's as close to one as he got. Now, this is not a question, but when you talked about Mr. Nenshi using the word colleagues, which I read your story on that, and I followed that. I thought it reminded me, this is not a question, of I'll never understand and I know nothing about politics. Everybody thinks I do because I've had a very good year and blah, blah, blah. The Tim Hudak campaign. And it just reminded me, I'm like, this guy has come out and said he's going to cut 100,000. Kathleen Moon was going to lose that election by all accounts. There's going to be a change. And this guy comes out and says, I'm going to cut 100,000 jobs. And all I thought to myself is, he could have gone to a camera and said, my name is Tim Hudak. It's nice to see you all. I'd love your vote. I'll talk to you later, and probably won an election. Instead, because you used the term colleagues, this is what it made me think of. He said, I'm going to cut the job of your sister. I'm going to cut the job of your friend.
Right.
I'm going to cut the job of your nephew's aunt. And I thought to myself, who in the world came up with this and let him do it? And that's why when you said colleagues, because these are your neighbors. These are your roommates. I never understood the psychology, and I hate that it worked even under the Fords, of throwing people under the bus who literally are coming to work, and whether it's private or public, they go to Loblaws. They're at No Frills. Right. They're at Sobeys. I never understood it. Okay, now.
Let me just say something
go ahead,
about
by all
that.
Means, please.
So a couple of days after the provincial election, I was at a dinner at Grano's for a mayoral candidate, but the mayoral candidate was actually still in rehab.
It wasn't me.
No, it wasn't you.
Okay,
and so Doug Ford was there speaking on behalf of his brother, and we ended up sitting side by side, which was kind of surprising for both of us. And he said exactly what you just said about Hudak's promise. He said there were ridings across the province where people said, "Oh yeah, my neighbor is a teacher, and my uncle works in the hospital, and they're all going to lose their jobs." It was terrifically bad advice.
And I know nothing about, again, I make this joke. People say to me, what are you this? What are you? I know nothing about politics other than I just say out loud what I think, and it resonated with people. I never saw something that made less sense to me. Now, we have some time left. I want to get into some issues because I want to get a little politically incorrect. You don't have to, but I'm going to. Sure. The Star today published a story. It's on their page, that the poorest or lowest income wards, or the wards where the Fords have, I'm going to make my question more open, where the Fords have done the most damage, cutting childcare, cutting TCHC, cutting affordable housing, same thing, but really being people who cut everything except for the people who fly private to Chicago or to rehab and have to turn around, or are worth tens and tens of millions of dollars, that all of the wards where the people are the poorest, the most recent immigrant, that's the people who voted for the Fords the most. Now, my question isn't for us to sit here and sing Kumbaya about this and to say these people, okay. There's a book called What's the Matter with Kansas? And it's all about how you get people, and people should Google this if they're listening. The thesis is how you get people to vote against their own economic interests. And in the States, this is a book from the States, 2004, people in red states that were being shafted when it came to healthcare, coal mining towns, people who can't find jobs, can't get educated, people who can't get their teeth fixed, would vote for the Republicans who were decimating those services because the Republicans were against two boys kissing. I'm being serious. Right. And Jon Stewart talked a lot about this many years ago. Literally would vote against every Democrat who said we need to increase funding because the Republicans got them whipped into a frenzy about two boys kissing. So it's voting against, that's the thesis of What's the Matter with Kansas. When you look at the demographic, and this is the proverbial you, because I do want to get a little politically incorrect here because I don't think we tell the truth in this city enough, not even close. Mm-hmm. When you have people at Ford Fests who are black, who are recent immigrants, who are Jamaican, Somalian, you name it, who are screaming horrible epithets and who are so supportive of the Fords, while the Fords through their back pocket are pickpocketing them and leaving housing in shambles and all of this. Should the city, and this is a question, I'm here to discuss things, okay? Should the city be bending over backwards and asking taxpayers, and I'm the guy who's raising taxes, so this is a peculiar question for me. Should the city be bending over backwards to ask taxpayers like you and me to spend more on people who, in a day and age of information, there's no excuse to not read a paper, not to go on your phone, you don't need a subscription, there's no paywall if you want to read an article like this. Should taxpayers be asked to subsidize voters who, through their own choices, and there's a history to this. I appreciate people can flame and say, I don't care. There is a history, and I get all the history. But at some point, when does individual responsibility to make responsible choices kick in? This is a question. You can touch it. It's a third rail, or don't touch it. But it's bothered me for the last few days when I looked at that and I thought to myself, this is really damaging stuff, and are we going to have an honest conversation about it? Any thoughts?
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. First of all, I've strongly resisted the notion that Ford Nation is some kind of homogenous entity.
Right.
It's a very diverse segment of our city, right? And people who voted for Ford vote for Ford for all sorts of reasons, and they come from all sorts of walks of life, from wealthy to not wealthy at all.
Not meaning to interrupt you, but I also saw in that story, somebody said quite interestingly that in the wards, the Ford Nation wards, it tended to be a small voter turnout, and it's open to hypothesis that the voter turnout was from people who are more well-to-do.
Right, and so I saw that map, and we actually have a piece that's facing today about that map. But what I haven't seen yet, and what I know is coming actually, is a more textured analysis of where the votes were cast, because the built form in the suburbs is really relevant. So you have a lot of high-rise, high-density buildings which have a lot of newcomers. That's where poverty is, vertical poverty in our city. What is the voter turnout in those kind of buildings relative to the voter turnout in more traditional sort of post-war subdivisions? So I think that's a question we don't know the answer to just yet. I think that the Ford's messaging all throughout was that it's a pocketbook message, and pocketbook messages resonate in a couple of different ways. I have a friend who's an investment banker, and the pocketbook message resonates with him because he wants to keep his income. There are other people who for whom there's not a lot of slack in their monthly income at all.
Paycheck to paycheck at best.
Paycheck to paycheck, and so if somebody says to them $60. It's like, okay, well, what am I going to give up for that $60?
Right.
So I think that message resonated, and I think there's a good reason with some voters that it did resonate. Now, the other caveat in all of this is that there's a lot of incomplete information. I've been a municipal affairs reporter for 17 years, and I'm always struck every single day. People ask me, questions about different things about municipal policy, and it's always remarkable to me, the depth of not misinformation but a lack of information. And the reason for this is that municipal government is complicated. They're complicated, technical, often kind of boring issues that touch you every single day, every time you flush the toilet, every time you step on a sidewalk.
There was a great story about water infrastructure online the other day.
Yeah, so these are really complicated issues. They're hard to grasp. They're hard to write about. They touch us all the time, and most people don't really understand how they get funded, why taxes work the way they work. There are a lot of people. There are 50% of the population of the city are tenants.
Yeah, I talked about that a lot. Yeah.
Do they know how much of their rent they pay? How much of their rent goes to property tax?
I don't think they even think they're paying it.
No, exactly, because they don't receive a tax bill.
Right.
Homeowners receive a tax bill. So I get a tax bill,
Yep.
and on the tax bill, it dutifully says what I paid last year.
And your 1.6% Scarborough subway tax.
Plus
the Fords don't raise taxes, remember?
Right. So it spells it out for me, and it makes it, it makes the work of city government very real for me. But if I pay rent, I don't get that information.
Right. You think it just goes to the landlord and off it goes?
Off it goes. I may have a life that doesn't permit me to spend a great deal of time reading about municipal politics. I may have 3 jobs.
But I want to go back. Because I want to. I'm not saying I want to hold your feet to the fire.
Sure,
You're not in court with me, but I really want to deal with this because it's bothered me. So I know the cuts that are happening in journalism.
Right.
I know how hard it is for you to make a living, and you're perceived to be one of the best, if not the best in the city. And you know that, so let's not skip the BS. You know that. But, you never know where you could be cut at a moment's notice. It happened at the CBC.
Right.
I have friends there. It's happening all over the place.
That's why it's great to be a freelancer.
No, but my point is, but this is serious stuff because these are people with talent.
Right.
And a lot of reporting has turned into being a sycophant or a note taker, a stenographer. where the hard journalism and the questions that you ask and Matt Elliott and a lot of great Edward Keenan, that is a dying breed. Right. But the reason I'm setting you up like this is because I don't want to lose the thrust of the question, which is, you are not a wealthy man. I am not a wealthy man, but I do pretty darn well.
Right.
When I see that the people, whether they're homogenous or heterogeneous, at Ford Nation or in Ford Nation or in TCHC buildings are voting for the Fords, the destroyers of lifestyles, the not truth tellers, the pandering to the lowest common denominators, it makes me question. This is a question, so everybody settle down who's going, Ari doesn't understand the history and privilege. I do, but I think questions should be asked because without the questions being asked, you don't get answers. My question is, when you are trying to make ends meet for your family, is there a problem when you're being asked to give more of your tax dollars to people in an information age? You can go to the library. I'm a big believer in libraries. You can read about this stuff. It's not an excuse to say you're too busy. You can read on the toilet. It's not a secret. Some people read on the toilet, okay? Is there a problem where people who are working paycheck to paycheck now have to pay more tax to subsidize people who really are voting against their own interests for a series of reasons that we don't talk about because it's the third rail?
Okay, so I'll answer the question with a question.
Yeah. What else would we do?
Right.
What should we do?
Yeah. No. You have a similar conversation around pensions and public pensions, and you have a lot of resistance to the idea that we need to increase the amount of pensions that are withheld, or the pension amount withheld from paychecks. There are lots of people who vociferously object to that. Yep. They have expression in political parties, but I'm going to support that because in the long run it makes our society healthier, that we don't have a lot of very poor seniors who are putting all sorts of pressures on the system that will eventually come back to bite me in the ass.
Okay. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So I think that, I don't want to be the guy that says, okay, well, all of us who could afford a little bit more taxes know what's good for all the people who can't afford a little bit more taxes. But there are, our society does provide services and benefits that we know are helpful
in our long-term better interest, rather than saying, you know what, you don't read the paper, you should be punished.
And the thing is if you've been a political reporter or if you've been a politician, you know the following, that people will complain about paying higher taxes, and at the same time they want more services.
That's right.
And people complain about the traffic and want more transit, and do you want to pay for it? No.
Right. And it's funny, I make the joke, and I'm going to leave his royal Fordness out of it, where I don't see anybody complaining about taxes when they walk into Mount Sinai.
Right.
They get the best care in the world. They skip the line. They get the best treatment in the world. And you don't come out of Mount Sinai or St. Mike's or wherever you are, Humber region, you don't come out with a bill for $50,000. Yeah. So this discussion about taxes has to become much more civilized and much more healthy. But let's leave that for now because we have 10 minutes. Sorry, you go ahead.
But it's a discussion about human nature, isn't it? Right?
Yes.
Because we don't know what we've got until it's been taken away from us.
Right. That's a song too. You don't know what you got.
No, I know it's a song, but it's a true statement.
Yes. And I just thought to myself, everybody who says you've got $60 back more in your pocket, or when Ford says there's a 20 on the ground, keep it for yourself.
Right.
I always think to myself, well, if that 20 is not going to change your life, but it could change many other people's lives, what kind of world are we living in? So that now leads to the next area I want to talk about for a couple minutes. I think we've had a real missed opportunity in this city, and you covered me on this from the beginning, where the day I launched in my press release, I said the fact that we're not talking about our police budget is a complete failure of leadership.
Right.
And we've missed that opportunity in this election. I'm not going to get into how frustrated I am with the two people who didn't win, and one in particular who sort of parroted what I and David Suknacki kept talking about. But I've said in many speeches, it is a bizarre notion of a city to me that we can spend $1 billion on a police budget, but we can't spend $1 million on people who are mentally ill. That's not a society that I understand. Do you believe that we've had a missed opportunity in this city to take a hard look at the police budget through this campaign, and even writing on the Pan Am Games, which has a $275 million security budget coming up? And I appreciate Ottawa is a horrible tragedy that happened, but things happen in the world, and overreacting to them never makes it better. I mean, there should never have been that stupid Iraq war because there was a 9/11 attack. I mean, that's a different conversation for another hour. But have we missed an opportunity to take a look at the one budget that is really an albatross around the neck of so many other budgetary programs in Toronto that require funds?
Well, I think that it's possible because Tory did say the other day that that one of the reasons that we have a low crime rate is because we have this big police infrastructure, and even Bill Blair will not make that connection. Right. So I'm hoping, and I'm hoping that critics will hold Tory's feet to the fire on this, that we will have that conversation. I mean, the question in my mind is how do you implement it? Because so much of the police budget is driven by the collective agreement and by arbitrated settlements, and there's a lot of salary in that budget. So there has to be a very determined effort to rein in that budget, and it has to be by somebody who's willing to take the heat over it, because there's a lot of political heat. So
True blue.
Yeah. So maybe what Tory does is he asks somebody to say, okay, this is your job. You take it on. David Sagnacki, you were very exercised about it. Ari Goldkind, you were exercised about it. Go to it. Find those savings. I think the other thing, and I appreciate the connection is making the connections between the police budget and the opportunity costs associated with the size of that budget. And I think the mental health piece is an important part. And I think that the more we can make those connections, the better off, the healthier this conversation is going to be. Yeah, and I think a lot of rank and file police officers would probably agree, because they know that, speaking of mental health, they realize that they are the default mental health service providers in the city.
And they don't want to be.
They don't want to be, because they know they don't have that skill
That's
set.
right. And I talk to them all the time. We shoot we call for the purpose of being on air, we call it shooting the breeze. Right. It's the same with lapel cameras. I talked about this through the summer with police officers that I know are good cops, and they're like, bring it on, because then I won't have to deal with the bullcrap use of force complaints, and they'll say, I won't get your client accusing me of nonsense, so I have to sit in this stupid room defending my reputation. And then I talk to the ones that I know are the cops that everybody has their eye. Well, we can't have that. It has to go through the union. And, you have the union head saying, well, we have to look at the privacy issues. What are you talking about? You're public. You're here to serve and protect. I don't see the other side of that argument. Now, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you some different questions, because I want to get into you and what you've thought and think, because I'm not sure these are questions you get asked all the time. Right. But I thought to myself, what would I ask somebody who's been a municipal journalist for 17 years? What is this city going to look like in 4 years? Is it going to look
in 4 years?
In 4 years, is it going to look the same as it does today? Better? Worse? No idea? No clue? Can't predict the future.
I think that you're going to see the pace of high-rise development sort of continue, maybe slow slightly. I think that you're going to see a skyline that has more high-rise commercial buildings in the downtown core, which is a good thing, and it's a healthy thing. And, if Tory wants to do anything in particular, if he can encourage more employment development in the core, that's a good thing, because it makes better use of resources. It deals with some of the it deals with some of the reverse commute issues. So I don't think we're going to have I don't think that we're going to have huge amount of progress on the transit file 4 years from now. So all of the crowding on the Yonge Street line will still be there. Right. It's totally within Tory's power to deal with some of the streetcar issues. He doesn't need to spend a lot of money on it. But the big construction items won't be, they'll be somewhat closer to completion, but not too much.
In your view, can you do anything serious about traffic in this city? Gridlock. Being congested is a sign of a successful city. It is. A paralyzed city is a different matter. Can a realistic, significant dent ever be put into traffic without congestion pricing?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. That's my question. Do you think in 4 years, no matter who's running for mayor, whether it's Michael Ford, that's a joke, or whoever the Fords changed their name to this time, do you think that we will be having the same discussions on the same issues that we've just had this election season?
No, with caution. Okay. I think that 4 years from now, because there's a fairly high level of alignment on a policy issue between a newly elected Toronto mayor and a newly elected provincial premier,
yes, that
we will have made some significant progress in bringing this the RER, the Smart Track plan along.
Right.
We won't be building it yet, but it will be
in the works.
Yeah, it'll be, the train will be out of the station.
Okay, no, that was good.
Yeah.
See, now I wish I came up with that. Okay,
that's why they pay me the big bucks.
Hey, you know who you are, and I know who you are. That's why you're here. Now, I hear the phrase. This is more of a yes or no in the 5 minutes that we have left. I hear all the time that diversity is our strength. And we're one Toronto, or we're going to be one Toronto, or we're going to heal this, and that's great, and I hope it happens. I think we're a divided city, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And you know, because there's a word I'm going to use, we're a city of enclaves, and that's how we live, and that's how we choose to live once we get to a certain level of income.
Right.
To me, that's more important than anything else we can tell ourselves when we pat ourselves on the back. Will that trend continue?
I think it probably won't change too much. Right. And it's, there are enclaves in a lot of large global cities. This kind of income polarization is not unique to Toronto.
No, and I talked about income inequality through this campaign, and I think it's one of the things that put me on the radar, because it's something that, if a mayor doesn't take a leadership position on it, because the mayor's life touches, you talked about flushing the toilet, the day-to-day life. I talked about dying with dignity, the right to end your life in a dignified way. And, some people said, you can't talk about that as a mayor. I'm like, no, a mayor leads, builds consensus. When Michael Bloomberg talked about gun control or his 7-Eleven Slurpees, it wasn't meant to affect a policy change. It was to get people talking. And I think that's what the mayor needs to do by leading. You've done this for 17 years. What are your pet peeves in politics, and particularly election seasons? What bothers you?
So one of the things that bothers me is that every year around budget time, we have this pretend conversation that there's this huge hole in the budget, and that and that we're going to face 15% tax increases when everybody knows how it's going to turn out in the end. So that's pet peeve one. I hugely regret that we end up having the transit conversation, and we relitigate that transit over and over again, and it's incredibly unhealthy. Hopefully, Tory will sort of put a stop to that, and that means not canceling the 2 LRT lines. So those are the big peeves, because that's where we're talking about sort of a lack of progress and the sort of eternal recurrence of certain problems.
And my last question, because everything in Toronto sometimes has a negative tinge to it, and I talked about building a city of yes. What do you love the most about Toronto?
I love the energy of the city. I find it a very exciting place to live, because it's it's a go-go hustle city that where there are a lot of new people, there are a lot of young people, there's a lot of change going on, and I find it increasingly over time like going to New York. You find that there's an energy about Toronto which is comes from the fact that there are new people in the city, and it's got new blood all the time.
Well, you couldn't have ended with a perfect answer, but for the fact that I think our cabs are too expensive compared to New York. But that's a different story. John Lorinc, thank you so much for joining us. I have a feeling we could have sat here for 3-4 hours talking. John, if people want to look up all of your writing, where can they find you if they want to read more about you?
Yeah, spacing.ca /Toronto. That's where I publish a column on Mondays, typically, about municipal affairs.
And you write for the Globe?
I write for the Globe. I write for the Star, for Walrus.
Yes, and anybody should just Google you and find in your Walrus article, by the way, before we end, I'm sure we're going to cut in a second. Please read the article you wrote in the Walrus about dealing with the mentally ill. It's truly an amazing article, and I hope people can find that.
Yeah, it's called Stand Down.
There you go. Thank you, John Lorinc. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you're listening live, thank you. And for the podcast, thank you for downloading us. Have a great day.
Thanks, Ari.